One of the biggest problems in America today politically is a problem most people don't even know about and no one's really talking about, at least in the political elite, though it is a problem that affects every American. And it's not a problem of left versus right or liberal versus conservative or on a single issue, but it's a problem of political representation. The promise of the American Constitution is that the US government is supposed to be a republic where the American citizens vote for people to represent them in the US Congress, especially the US House of Representatives. The original formulation for how that would work in the Constitution was one representative per every 30,000 people in a state. Now, there's problems of drawing the lines and gerrymandering, and that is a serious issue. And there's also the problem of the presupposition of whether one person can really take the views of 30,000 people and synthesize them into a coherent view of policy. You could even make the argument that one person representing two people that disagree may run into a huge tension because he really or she really represent them both? Now, eventually, Congress, the US House of Representatives, that half of Congress, was capped at 435 members, representatives. California, for example, has 53. Other states have different amounts based on their populations. But what that amounts to now, with a country of 327 million plus people and growing, is if we averaged it all out, one representative has to represent over 750,000 people. And if you thought it was difficult to represent 30,000 people, well, imagine what it would be like to represent 750,000 people. And doesn't work out that evenly because certain states have more people, for example, like California. But that means that actually the more populous states get less representation than the less populous states, although most Americans are probably feeling that they are not truly represented by this group of 435. In that sense, it can become simply an oligarchy of self-interested political elites working toward their own ends and trying to achieve votes and money from different entities. And they are more likely in that situation to listen to those who are politically well-connected and those who have money toward their campaigns than they are to listen to you or I as the average American. So it's sometimes suggested, well, let's make the House of Representatives bigger. I've heard this since college. I used to argue this, that let's uncap it, go back toward one representative toward every 30,000 people. However, what that would mean and what that would entail in reality is we would have a House of Representatives of over 10,000 people. And while people may say, okay, well, that's great. Now we've got 10,000 people representing all of America rather than 435. But there is a size and scale at which something can work effectively. For example, pens are almost all a certain size. You may have seen oversized pens that are kind of a novelty product as a joke, but pens have a certain size and scale to be able to work the way they are. If they're any smaller than about this size or any larger than about this size, they get to a point either way where they are no longer useful. And the same thing may be said for legislative bodies. I'm sure we've all been in the situation where we have been in a meeting with 30 people, or a meeting with 50 people, or a meeting with 100 people, or a meeting with 5 people. And it's easier to get 5 people on the same page rather than 30 in most cases. Now, it's not impossible to meet with those numbers, but it becomes more difficult the more voices that you include. And the U.S. House of Representatives today has difficulties getting 435 people into some sort of agreement, debating, voting, all these things. If you don't believe me, just watch some C-SPAN. Now, if we bumped up the numbers to, now imagine having a meeting with 1,000 people. Now imagine having a meeting with 10,000 people. There are real size and space constraints. These people would have to sit in a stadium. And something I didn't think about till yesterday was, how are they all going to talk to each other, find some sort of common agreement, write laws, make laws, that really try to represent the American people? Let's assume that they're all trying to do their best and doing that, which is a big assumption. 10,000 people with just 1 minute to speak each on what they believe is the most important issue in the United States today, and what should be done about it. So imagine you're in this group of 10,000 in a stadium, and you are going to, the microphone is being passed around, and you are strictly allowed 1 minute, no more. And you are strictly allowed 1 minute to speak on what you believe to be the most important issue in the United States and what ought to be done about it. And that's very difficult. But now imagine that you have to be there and the microphone's going around and different people are mentioning different issues. And some you think are right or you agree with, some you don't agree with, some you think are strange and unimportant and have nothing to do with the discussion. So there could be somebody, I think the most important issue is war, and we need to have less of it. Somebody else says, I think the most important issue is war, but we need to have more of it, or we need to fight this war. Or somebody says, I think the most important issue is the debt. Or somebody says, I think the most important issue is healthcare. Or somebody says, I think the most important issue is the redwoods in California. And people are all going around. Now, I want you to imagine, after a certain amount of speeches, how many could you remember? And how many could you have the mental stamina to pay attention to for 10,000 minutes? And then what's the likelihood that your speech will be taken seriously, agreed with, and remembered? This is not debating. This is not crafting policy. This is not talking together and working together to get on the same page. This is just introductory speeches on what everybody thinks is the most important issue facing the United States. And what this would amount to, 10,000 minutes would amount to 167 hours, almost 167 hours. There are 168 hours in a week, 24-hour days, 7 days a week. Which means that just to make this imaginary event happen would take a week's worth of time, 24 hours a day for 7 days, just shy of a week's worth of time. So it would be, in my estimation, totally ineffective. But now we are faced with this huge problem. Each year, Americans have less and less representation, meaning that they feel, and they're correct, that their representation, their voice in the American government is diminished. The US Congress becomes more of an oligarchy than a representative republic, and even more vulnerable to corruption because of that, since it's easier now with all these voices to listen to other influences rather than the people that elected them. And if we try to fix the problem by making the House of Representatives bigger, in accordance with what the original Constitution said, now we have a government that can not even function, even in the most basic matters of discussion and debate, let alone legislation. So this is a serious problem facing and affecting every American. And yet, no politician running for office is talking about this. I doubt even politicians are aware of this problem, and most Americans aren't aware of this problem either, except that they do have a sense, I believe, that they feel they are not being effectively represented, but they don't know why. And this is not like a math problem where there's just one answer that can be given. This is something that has to be taken seriously. And I've had students advocate on this basis. Well, we need to control the population. Well, the population is what it is, regardless of doing that. And I think that the measures to do so would be tyrannical as well. But the size of America in regard to its government is not effective in order to be a republic. Yet a republic is what the government is supposed to be. I'm not advocating for a larger government. You can't get a larger government than the United States government. It's the biggest government on the face of the earth. I'm not advocating anything. I'm just bringing up the problem that faces all of us and affects all of us as Americans, yet no one seems to be aware of it. And it's not really in the interest of politicians to mention this.